I'm going to be talking about this collection of objects. This came to us about 5 years ago, and it was a new departure for us, but we agreed to take it on, and I'm very glad that we did, and I'll explain why in this talk. The Baliem Valley in Papua is one of the last places on Earth that was contacted by the outside world, by modernity. There are many things about it which are interesting, but this makes it one of the most unique and interesting places that I've ever worked on. So where is this located exactly? Papua is the western half of the island of New Guinea, which is located just north of Australia. And the island of New Guinea is divided into two parts. In the west, there is Papua, which is owned by Indonesia, and the eastern part is Papua New Guinea, which is an independent country. But even though the island is divided politically, culturally it's all of a piece. And the area that we're going to be focusing on is the Baliem Valley, indicated by the rectangle in the center there, which is in the highlands in the western half of Papua. This area, like most of New Guinea, is a patchwork of different ethnic groups. It's a high mountain area, and it's a broad valley between two mountain ranges. And in between those mountain ranges are a number of different peoples. But the biggest population is located in what's called the Grand Valley, which is this broad river plain where the Dani or Hubula people, as they like to be called these days, are located. And most of what you're going to see today is either from the Hubula people in this region, but also from the Yali people to the east of them in the highland areas, because they were contacted even later than the Hubula people. They were first contacted in the 70s and 80s by missionaries, and when Hampton visited, their traditions and customs were pristine. So this collection came from a guy called Hampton. He was a remarkable man. He was trained as a geologist, and he worked for the Pertamina Corporation in Indonesia for many years. But then he visited the Baliem Valley in the early 1980s, and he became fascinated by this area. And he quit his job, and he spent the next 11 or 12 years researching this unique peoples. He collected around 900 objects. He took around 20,000 photographs, all of which we have, and also produced a large volume of field notes and notebooks. And this is what makes his collection so valuable, is that a lot of times objects come onto the antique and collector market from Papua and from Papua New Guinea, and they're avidly bought by collectors, but the provenance and the information about the cultures that made them is lost, is gone. But Hampton's work is important because we have that provenance, and we have that information. He was also a complete enthusiast and a great person. I never met him personally, but he was obviously somebody who made friends with everybody he met, including the people in the Baliem Valley. And he visited them repeatedly over a period of a little more than a decade, became friends with many of the tribal leaders, and was able to get insights into their ways of life and their material culture, which nobody before him had managed to achieve. So these people in Papua, in the highland region, have been separate from the rest of humanity for at least 60,000 years. The island of New Guinea was first populated 50 to 60,000 years ago, and the coastal regions were well connected with the trading networks that extended across Asia. So Chinese and Vietnamese traders brought goods along the coastline, and Dong Son bronzes, for example, which come from Vietnam, have been found along the Papuan coastline. But the interior is a very different matter. It's extremely difficult to move around. It's a mountainous region. And because relations between neighboring groups were often hostile, few people ventured more than a few kilometers from their home village. So items were traded, but they were passed from hand to hand. So, for example, this guy is wearing, he's got some couscous fur on an armband. I was going to say that he's got some shells in his headgear, but I think that's not shells. But NASA shells and cowrie shells were popular trade items. But the people who traded them in the Baliem Valley had no idea where these things came from. They thought the NASA shells grew on a tree somewhere in another part of New Guinea, and the existence of an ocean was unknown to them. So trade existed, but it was very, very short scale. These people raise a number of different interesting issues, which I'm going to talk about today. One issue is just how do you survive as a small group of people in an upland environment in New Guinea, and how do you make your life, and how does it differ, and how is it similar to what we do? But it also raises questions about art and self-expression. You know, what forms does this take in Hubula society? And also about religion and spirituality. And it's not so much that the Baliem Valley inhabitants had anything special to say in these topics, but the fact that they have been cut off for so long, and the ways they do things are different to our own, and it causes us to think and reflect and ponder on what these things mean in our own cultures, as well as those of the Baliem Valley. I'm going to go back and talk briefly about the collection itself. This is when we first saw it in 2019. Bud Hampton died in 2017. His family didn't know what to do with the collection, and this is the state we found it in their attic. It was pretty well cared for, but the conservation and the storage was a little bit random. There was no catalogue, and some of the items were starting to deteriorate. So the first task we had was to do some serious conservation work and also to rehouse these items. So we spent about a year and a half doing conservation work. Some of the items needed cleaning. Some of the items we needed to remove pests and to stabilize them. This is Callie German, who joined us as a conservator for about 6 months or so during the project. And photography. I was in charge of the photographic work, and we photographed everything in its original state as it came to us, and then we photographed it again after conservation work and trying to make photographs that would be publication quality. And this also serves as a record of the conservation work that we've done. So if anybody wants to look back and see what was the condition of the item when it first arrived, they can look back and see exactly what changes were made. And we photographed all of these 900 objects. This is an adze from the Hubula people. It's a stone blade bound with rattan. And it's one that was stored in a hut for 30 or 40 years, so it's picked up this sort of brown patination from the smoke in a hut. And the items are now stored in acid-free polypropylene boxes with all the acid-free materials and bindings, and tissue paper to protect them, and bubble wrap. This is a selection of amulets. The Hubula people were very keen on these protective amulets. They had a lot of different kinds. And these have all been carefully, individually packaged, catalogued, and stored, ready, as Sandra says, to eventually be repatriated to Papua. So I'm going to start now with some pictures from Bud Hampton's field research. He took photographs in the 1980s. He was a pretty good photographer, and he used a good quality Kodachrome slide film, so the slides have kept their color remarkably well. And we were able to scan a lot of these photographs and found some very interesting material. This is a Yali man from the highlands in the east. He's got an adze over his shoulder, and he's wearing a net bag over his head, which is used for carrying things. And he's wearing a penis gourd, which you can see sticking out the front. And this is something that all the Hubula and the Yali people, the men, wore. They wouldn't go out of their hut without one of these things on. And most men had a selection of different gourds, different shapes and sizes, and they would put them on depending how they felt that particular day. They had no significance. They were really for enjoyment purposes. The other thing he's got is a kind of skirt which consists of rattan hoops. This is actually armor. The Yali were threatened by several neighboring groups, and they were subject to surprise attacks, especially when they were working in the fields. And the rattan hoops provided some protection. Some of them also made a sort of woven grass jerkin, which was a kind of a form of armor as well. So their lives were not only tough from a survival point of view, they also had to cope with hostility from neighboring tribes. This is a group of Yali huts in the highlands. They lived in very small groups. Men and women lived in different huts. So this is the inside of a man's hut, very, very small scale, with 4 or 5 individuals, family members and close relatives. In the lower areas where the Hubula lived, they lived in larger compounds, and this is one of those, in family groupings of maybe 20 or 30 people, in a compound which had a defensive wall around it, because they also were subject to surprise attacks from neighboring groups. They also maintained watchtowers, which were manned 24/7 in case of attack from neighboring groups. The first people who flew over this highland region were amazed. They expected to see jungle with a few wandering tribes. What they actually saw when they flew over the Baliem Valley were these beautifully and carefully constructed field systems, because the people in this part of the highlands were agriculturalists. And they maintained these intricate fields where they grew sweet potatoes and taro. And in the lower-lying areas, they maintained these drainage ditches, like the one you can see on the left. And the only tool that they had to work the fields was a digging stick, which is a long stick with a slight spade-like shape at one end. And when missionaries arrived, they brought metal spades, and they were very eagerly adopted by the farmers in this region. The other thing they kept was pigs. And pigs were an important part of the ceremonial life, because a diet of taro and sweet potatoes is pretty boring. But the thing you had to look forward to were feast days, weddings and funerals, and some other occasions as well. And on these occasions, you would get to eat pork. And this was cooked in a thing called steam bundle. And these photographs are of Hubula people preparing one of these steam bundles. You take grasses and you put them in a depression in the ground, and then you put hot rocks on top of that, and then you pile on greens and edible vegetables, and then you put a whole flattened pig on top of that, and then finish the thing off with more grasses and vegetables. And you leave the thing to steam for 2 or 3 hours. And Bud Hampton said when it was opened up, it was the best pork he'd ever tasted. The other thing that Bud was fascinated with, being a geologist, was the stone tools that he found these people making. Now, stone tools are the basis of our ancestors' ways of life, going back tens or hundreds of thousands of years. But there were only a couple of places on the planet still making these things in the middle of the 20th century. One was the Amazon basin, and the other was this part of Papua. And the Hubula people had basically finished with stone tools. They were using missionary-brought metal tools by the time Hampton arrived. But the Yali people were still making and using and trading stone tools. And this was the last chance for any of us to see how this job was actually done, Because archaeologists, we dig up these tools, but they don't have insights into how exactly they were quarried and made. And what Hampton discovered, first of all, is that fire was the basic quarrying tool. Both of the Yali people and also another group who made stone tools to the west called the Una people. And in both cases, they would use fire. The Yali would build a fire on a boulder in the river, and the Una people would build a fire against the cliff face. And they'd let it burn for about an hour or so. And then when the fire was extinguished and started to cool down, big slabs of rock would ping off the rock face. And Hampton went close to photograph this, and his Una guide said, come back, because you're likely to be hit by flying fragments of rock. So that was the basic quarrying method. And then the tools were shaped roughly by knapping in 2 stages. They did a rough stage at the quarry site to try to reduce the weight of the tools. And the way you did it was by taking your piece of stone and striking it, picking a pebble from the river as a striking stone, and then chipping away at it until it has the shape you want. This description makes it sound easy. It isn't. I've tried it. You also have to cope with bits of flying stone, and these folks didn't have safety glasses or anything else. And when you looked at their fingers, you could see the cuts and abrasions they picked up from knapping stone tools. And then the final stage was to grind them. The tools were ground to a fine edge. And some of them were absolutely beautifully shaped. I've got one of these blades here today, which you can take a look at later. But they were ground and then finished to a fine polish. And these were like the Swiss Army knives that we have today. They were beautiful objects. They selected beautiful hard stones. They were very fond of greenish green schists. And they polished them. And a good adze blade was worth about the same as a good adult pig. And if you wanted to marry a girl in the Baliem Valley, you would need a gift for her father. And one of these stones, a good example of one of these adze blades, would be a suitable gift. And the great thing about ground edge tools and the great advance that these represent over the flaked tools that our distant ancestors made is that these blades can be resharpened when they get blunt. And you don't have to be a specialist in order to resharpen. It's just patience and a grinding stone. But you can see what happened to blades over time. They started out like the one on the left, and as they were used and resharpened, they got smaller and smaller. When they got to the size of the blade on the right, they were not thrown away. They were kept and used as talismans, and I'll show you an example of that later. This is a guy, a Yali guy, attaching a blade to the haft of an adze. And again, for an archaeologist, this is absolutely priceless because we can see how the tool was set and how it was attached to a wooden handle. And wooden handles rarely survive in the archaeological record. And it turns out that these folks were familiar with 2 different kinds of tool. They knew how to haft a blade as an adze, so that where the blade is at right angles to the haft. And they also hafted them as an axe, where the blade is set in the same plane as the handle. I'll show you examples of that in a minute. And one of these things, a well-made adze, was truly the mark of an adult man. And the most important feature of it should be that it should balance perfectly on the shoulder, so that you would walk around with this, and it's a status object as well as a useful tool. And they were used for felling trees, both for firewood and also for clearance for agriculture. They practiced swidden agriculture, so they would clear an area, grow crops on it, and then leave it fallow and clear another area in another region a few years later. And again, for an archaeologist, this is absolutely priceless. It turns out that the tree felling technique is quite different to what we do with a metal axe. With a metal axe, you grasp it with both hands and you take a big swing at waist level. If you do that with one of these kind of tools, you'll probably break it. The way they used them was much more delicately. They would use them with an overhead swing, and they came down at a steep angle onto the trunk, and they gradually shaved inwards, taking off a few millimeters at a time. So patience and precision, rather than brute force method, brought down the tree. And we have several examples of these. These are hubula adzes from the Baliem Valley. The one on the right has been decorated by wrapping palm around the handle and then smoking it over a fire and then taking the palm leaf away to make this sort of decorated effect. This is an example of the axes that they made. For the hubula people, these were rarely used in anger. They were largely ceremonial tools. But they were kept because they were impressive status objects. The blades were huge. This thing is about day high. And the remarkable thing about these is that some axes which have been dug up from Swiss lake settlements from the Neolithic period have almost exactly the same form. And the key thing is you've got to have a really heavy bulbous head that resists splitting when you bash that axe against a tree. So, amazing data for the archaeologist. I know some archaeologists, and some of them are aware of this work, but you'd be surprised how little it's read by archaeologists. Archaeologists and ethnographers, they're two different tribes, and they tend not to talk, not as much as they should anyway. And I've shown some of these photographs to archaeologists, and they're like, oh my God, why have we not seen these things before? Anyway, an object that an archaeologist would almost never see, very, very rare. As important as the adze and the axe was the net bag, the noken, mostly used by women, occasionally by men, but more useful to women. And for hubula women, this was an item of clothing, as well as a means of transporting goods. And no woman would step out of the woman's hut without at least one of these over her head. And they were used for transporting produce from the fields, tools. You could put a baby in one, and some women would have 4 or 5 of these things over their heads when they went out in the morning. They were not woven in the usual sense. There was no weaving looms. They had no spindles for spinning. So the string for making these bags was made by rubbing bast fiber, tree fiber, on the thigh. And they made a beautiful 2-ply string with just the hands and thigh rolling. And the bag was made with a figure-of-8 looping technique. There are no knots. So it makes a stretchy, extendable bag that will stretch to fit whatever you put inside it. And there were large bags for daily use. And then there were some very fine bags which were used as wedding gifts and as a kind of currency exchange. This one has partly been colored with red ochre. And then we have weapons, of course. If you're going to be attacked, you've got to have weapons to defend yourself. And the hubula also loved to hunt, but their population was relatively dense in the Baliem Valley, and most of the game animals had been hunted out years ago. But still, if anything interesting appeared in the hedgerow, they would grab a bow and arrow and loose off at it. But the most important use for bows and arrows was for warfare. And this was both a necessity and also it was strongly linked to male identity. So the status and the standing of a man in all of the Highland communities was related to how successful he was in war, and specifically how many people he'd killed. And there were basically two types of conflict. There were these large-scale, almost like set-piece battles which took place on open ground with almost a sporting atmosphere. Everybody dressed up in their finest feathers and paint. And they went out in two big opposing groups, and they threw spears and shot arrows at each other. And the atmosphere, was like a sporting event, even though the intent was deadly. And the other kind of conflict happened at night. Sneak attacks would take place in the middle of the night. And this is why the compounds needed high fences around them. And people were killed and pigs were stolen. And women were also stolen and taken to neighboring groups. And we have a selection of bows and arrows in the Hampton archive. This is a bow on the left and a group of arrows. These are some close-ups of the arrowheads. The one on the left with a leaf-shaped blade is specifically used for killing pigs in ceremonies. All of the others are for warfare in this group. And they have very fine points that tended to break off when they struck an enemy. And some of the three on the right-hand side have little bits of orchid fiber wrapped around the top. This is not decoration. The idea is that when this penetrates your skin, the orchid fiber is left behind when you pull the arrow out and is very likely to become septic and kill you, because there were no antibiotics in this area. And for the Hubula, if somebody died a month after the battle, that was just as much a success as if they killed them on the day, accompanied by much singing and rejoicing. So the facts of Hubula warfare. And then we also have a selection of other objects of ritual or decorative function. These are cassowary feather wands, ostensibly for keeping the flies off, but in fact badges of office for the big men who were the chiefs of the tribal society. And when they went out to war, the chief would take one of these in hand and stand on the highest hillock and direct the proceedings with his cassowary feather wand. This is an amulet, and we have a vast number of different amulets which are designed to protect you against evil spirits and evil influences and bring you good luck. And we also have some charms that were used for success in romance. If you liked a particular woman, you would get the medicine man to produce an amulet that would win her affections for you. This one consists of a mouth harp on the left. The thing in the center is a kind of the cocoon of a moth called a pumpalep. And on the right is a tiny, tiny adze blade that has worn down so much it's not usable anymore, and it's been converted into a little charm with the net handle around it. And these are head ornaments. They're pieces of parrot feather and bird of paradise in the center. And these were used by men as head ornaments. This is one of the Hubula dressed for war. He's got boar's tusks in his nose, and the boar's tusks are the only thing which have any meaning in this ensemble. It means that he's a successful warrior. All the rest of this is decoration and showing off. Parrot feather headdress, armbands, I think, of couscous fur. And then he's got this long bib of nassa shells. And these are the ones I mentioned earlier that they got from trade. They came up through many, many pairs of hands from the oceans, and they were considered valuables in the Baliem Valley. This is a parrot feather headdress. This is an extremely rare thing because there were no parrots left in the Baliem Valley. So the feathers had to be obtained by trade at some expense. And this is the man who sold it to Bud Hampton. We don't have his name, but there he is. And the headdress consists of looped bast fiber at the bottom, decorated with yellow orchid fiber. and then the parrot feathers stuck into this to make a sort of crown. And we have mouth harps. This was the only musical instrument that the Hubula used. And these were made from cane using just a sharpened piece of flint to carve these mouth harps. It's the kind you hold over your mouth and it goes ga-ding-a-ding-a-ding-a-ding. I can't do the sound exactly. But it's a thing which is found all over Asia, including Papua. And these are armbands, and they were plaited by men who plaited them directly on their arms using a bone point. And this brown fiber is extracted from fern stems. The one thing we don't have from the Baliem Valley is wood sculpture. This is the thing which collectors love to collect, and it mostly comes from the Sepik River region in Papua, and it comes from the Asmat people in the south of Papua. But there was no wood carving, decorative wood carving in the Baliem Valley. But instead, I think the number one form of self-expression that we find in this region is body painting using clay and ochre and other materials. And anytime there was a wedding, a funeral, or a battle, that everybody would decorate each other with this kind of body paint. So it's purely for self-expression, but Hampton asked if the symbols they painted on their bodies had any meaning. And they said, no, it's just for fun. It's just what we like to do. This is a woman decorating her daughter. The daughter's wearing a grass skirt. The woman on the left is wearing an orchid fiber skirt, which is characteristic of married women, and a net bag, of course. And these are some of this ephemeral art form, used, enjoyed for a day, and then washed off. You know, some of the early explorers of this region accused the Hubula people of having no art, and here it is. Here is their art. The other thing which raises interesting questions about art and collecting are the wealth stones and sacred stones of the Hubula people, which are very characteristic of this group. They're not found in the same form elsewhere in New Guinea. And these were stones that were important part of the wealth of families, and they were exchanged in ritual gift exchanges at funerals and weddings. And we have a number of these in the collection, and they tend to be beautifully polished greenstone, and most of them have some kind of binding of orchid fiber. And these were extremely important objects for families in this area. They were actual literal representations of family wealth. But they were not just collected for their own sake. They formed part of ritual gift exchanges and circulation. So at funerals, for example, these stones would be laid out, and some of them would be given as compensation to families who'd lost family members. And these two men are laying out a display of these stones. They put grass on the ground first, and then they lay out these long net bags. And the use of these particular bags is just for the display of these stones. And then on top of these, they place the stones in groups of 3 or 5. And then on top of those, they lay a band called a jerek, which is cowrie shells attached to a looped fiber band. And this is also a form of currency in this area. And these are really quite beautiful, literally monolithic objects. The biggest one on the left is about half a meter long. Most of them are between about a foot long and a yard long. And they have these very delicate skirts around them. The Hubula don't claim that their stones are gendered, but the decorations they put on them are very similar to women's skirts. So the orchid fiber at the top looks like a married woman's skirt, And then the grass skirt underneath is like the grass skirt that young unmarried girls wear. And there are also some parrot feathers and other items attached to this stone. And one of the nice things about Hampton's collection is that these stones have their original attachments. They're very delicate and they're often lost. So museums that have examples of these stones, often they've lost the fiber attachments, and we have them in good condition. And the interesting thing for me is that the Hubula men who were in charge of these stones were connoisseurs of these objects. They were brought out, they were discussed, they were displayed. There was a strict hierarchy of value. Certain types of stone were valued more than others. Longer, bigger stones had more value than shorter stones. And they would bring them out, they would discuss them with them, they would debate, they would discuss and argue how to lay these stones out at funerals and weddings. And they displayed connoisseurship. And there are a lot of parallels between Western collecting, I think, which is both a male and female activity, but I think it's fair to say that men have the edge in collecting. Where in our society, collecting is very closely associated with status. Collection of art and the exchange of art and the display of art is connected with status, especially male status. And this is something I think you see a close parallel to in Hubula society. So even though they didn't have art, they certainly had collecting. And there are also parallels with cultures in the Americas in the sense that these objects were made to be exchanged and given away. So they're a little bit similar to the potlatch ceremonies of the Northwest in the Americas, where the idea was not to accumulate wealth, but to be able to give it away, and almost to embarrass others into reciprocating, and to display your status and power. A few of these stones, a small number, were consecrated as sacred ancestor stones. This is one example. These are relatively rare objects, and again, this is something which, as far as I know, is not in any other museum collection anywhere in the world. And these objects contained the souls of ancestors, particularly men who'd been successful in battle in the past. And these spirits were extremely important to the Hubula people. Some of them were plain, a few of them were decorated. These are the boar's tusks that a man would have worn in his nose in life, and they're now on his decorating his ancestor stone. And these stones are sources of power, of spiritual energy in the community. And they had a direct and close relationship with their ancestors through these stones. The stones were kept in a thing called a Guinea cabinet, which was at the back of the men's hut. This would be a hut where a group of maybe 30 men would sleep in the hut, and the stones were kept at the back, along with pigs' tusks below, which were the relics of past feasts. And they were carefully wrapped and cared for, and only the men were allowed to see these stones, whereas the wealth stones could be brought out at any ceremony. These were kept secret and were only shown to initiated men. And we have a number of them, and they are in their original wrappings, which is also amazing. This is one example. And inside this wrapping is the ancestor stone, a couple of boar's tusks, 2 pig's tails, and a couple of cowrie shells. Similar stones were also used by the Yali people to the east. But in the case of the Yali, when they were visited by missionaries in the 70s and 80s, the missionaries made them throw away their ancestor stones and burn the skulls that they kept for ancestor worship. And so we know very little about the Yali traditions, which is a bit of a tragedy. The style of the stones was different, as you can see. They were flat stones decorated with ochre. But we know almost nothing about how they were used. Hampton visited them, and he let it be known that he was interested in these stones. And a young boy brought one of these things out of the forest where it had been hidden and sold it to Hampton. But we know nothing about what the ceremonies were like that they were used in. But we do know a lot about how the hubula stones were used in the main part of the Baliem Valley, thanks to Bud Hampton and also a couple of missionaries who recorded the ceremonies. This is another example of an ancestor stone, and it's in this bundle, wrapped in a bundle of bark fiber cloth, and it's also in the same bundle are boar's tusks, a small knife, and then the object on the right is a feather, and this was attached on the outside of the bundle. And the idea was that the spiritual energy from the stone was so strong that when you wrapped it up and you'd finished using it for your ceremony, your hands became charged with spiritual energy, and you had to discharge them by using this feather to brush across them. This is a close-up of the same bundle. And this is Hampton's photograph of one of these stones being brought out for a ceremony. And they were brought out for a number of different reasons. One reason relates to sickness, because the hubula believed that if somebody became sick, this was because of a disturbance in their soul, probably caused by an evil spirit or some sort of evil influence, occasionally by witchcraft. And you needed the energy from these stones in order to drive out the evil influences. And the healing ceremonies used the stones and also laying on of hands in order to cure the sick person. The other important type of ceremony was for success in war. And for these ceremonies, a pig was sacrificed, hands were laid upon it, and then offerings were made to the stones in the Guinea cabinet of sweet potatoes and pig meat being consumed by the ceremony's participants. So, from all this information, we've distilled a book, a catalogue of the collection with a lot of background material. And in order to check that we were on the right track, we took a draft of the book in 2024 back to Papua, and we consulted with several community elders from the Baliem Valley. This was Adipus Wetapo, who's a local historian, who gave us a lot of helpful advice, and Engelbert Surabat, who was also here about a month ago looking at the collection. And these older guys were able to recognize some of the younger people in Bud Hampton's photographs, and we managed to put some additional names to the images and correct some things that we had slightly wrong. But Papua today is not the same place that it was in the 80s. It's changed enormously, and like everywhere else, Papuans want to be part of modernity. They want mobile phones, they want motorbikes, and why not? But we also took the collection to a workshop for curators in Jayapura, which is the main town in Papua, where they were running an event for students and trainee conservators and curators for Papuan museums. And we showed them the collection, the images of the objects that we'd assembled. And the older men recognized many of the objects, but the younger students had never seen them. And some of them were in tears because they recognized a chunk of their culture which had been completely lost to them. So this collection is not only important for anthropologists and archaeologists, it's important for the community. And that's why we're so keen that the collection should go back to Papua. And the intention is that this will form the nucleus of a new museum in the Baliem Valley. Wamena, the largest town, has now become the capital of a new province in Papua. And the land has been secured for the museum, and we hope that in 2 or 3 years the collection will be housed there. It's going to go back to Papua in about a month's time, and then it'll be stored in Jayapura for a period of time, and then we hope it will go to Wamena, fingers crossed. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I hope that's been interesting. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.